what's up? Red Panda Anthem. Red Panda, what's good?
So let me ask you this: for education, I saw you was talking to little baby the other day, and you was kind of educating him on why governor is so important. Can you just explain? So there's no black governors currently, right?
Correct.
All right. So there's no black governors currently in America, and from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong. The reason why that's such a big issue, and the reason why the governor is so important, is that the governor is really the most powerful person in the state, because they control budgets, they control a lot of the state issues, even more so than state representatives or senators. And the president doesn't really have power on a state level. This is why, like COVID, is so many different rules depending on which state you're in. So can you give us an education on why the governor is so important and why people need to pay more attention to who their governor is?
Absolutely. So let's think about it this way. When we think about the structure of government, we have been trained to focus on the president because that's the most powerful job in the nation. And for Black and brown people, it's also been incredibly important because states have often refused to acknowledge our citizenship and our humanity. So I'll use 3 examples. Stand Your Ground, the law that killed Trayvon Martin, that wasn't federal law. That was signed by the governor of Florida. That's how Stand Your Ground became. But once it happens in a state, it spreads like a contagion. So now you've got Stand Your Ground in Georgia and everywhere else. Number 2, mass incarceration did not start with the 94 crime bill. 3 Strikes You're Out was actually done by the governor of California in 1994. The federal government decided to follow, but it started with the governor. And Jim Crow, the stripping Black people of humanity for 150 years, never had a single federal law. It was all state laws signed by governors. And so when we think about how our lives are lived, we think about the presidency because it's national or the mayor because it's hyper local. But all the money that comes from the federal government comes through the state. The governor decides. All of the things your mayor wants to do in the South, especially in Georgia, has to be approved by, if it's a big program, it has to be approved by the governor. One example is that in 2003, I worked for Shirley Franklin. I wrote the first living wage law in the history of the state of Georgia. It would have guaranteed that any company doing business in Georgia had to pay a living wage. It could have transformed the economies of thousands of Georgians. We got that legislation through the city council, the mayor signed it, and the following January, the governor signed a law making it illegal for any city to pass a law guaranteeing a wage. That's what the state does. If you're worried about housing, the governor has to sign legislation that says that that local government has the authority to actually enforce housing rules and make sure that you can afford to live in the home that you live in. But for business owners, where the governor is so incredibly important is that most of the decisions we think have to be made by committee, in Georgia, it gets made by the governor. Right now, the governor of Georgia is spending billions of dollars. Every time you hear him announce money that's being, out of that COVID money that's being spent, he doesn't have to ask a single person for permission. He decides by himself, with whomever he decides to bring in the room, how he wants to spend that money. So the question is, whose name do you want to have on the checkbook? Someone who does not believe in investing in communities of color, someone who has never demonstrated any interest until it was election year, or someone who has come up the hard way through our business community and through our city and state, who has the knowledge and experience, but also now the authority to get good done. And the shorthand is, imagine Maynard Jackson and what he did for Atlanta. Imagine if he had been governor of Georgia. That's the kind of governor I could be.
Wow.
Yeah. So in order to have the right governor, you have to mobilize people to vote. And one of the things that you did in general election, and rightfully so, you were credited with helping win Georgia and ultimately winning the general election for Biden, was getting people out. But when you get people out in numbers, certain things start to change, and you start to see more voter suppression, and you see more voter discrimination. So my question to you is like, what do we do now, right? It feels like we have to press the reset to make sure that people understand the influence and impact that this is going to have. And so is there education around it? How are we telling the people, the population of Georgia, like, hey, there are some changes. Here's what you need to know before you go out?
Well, most of my entrepreneurship has focused on business oriented things because I grew up poor. I didn't like it and don't ever want to do it again. And I like being able to take care of myself and take care of my family. But I've also been very aggressive about nonprofit work and civic work. So I created the New Georgia Project. I'm no longer affiliated with it, but I launched the New Georgia Project in 2013. That's the organization that did a lot of the work on getting people registered. I created Fair Fight, which is the work that we've been doing to make sure that we have fair voting laws, or if the laws are not fair, that we know why they're not fair and we fight back. I created the organization Fair Count. Fair Count made certain that we had an accurate census for the first time in 30 years, actually counting Black and brown folks. And it was the first year in almost 30 years we did not have a statistical undercount. And that matters to businesses because the money that comes to the state through the SBA and through all of these different grants and loans, it's all based on the accurate count of the people in your state. So when Black people get undercounted, we also get under-resourced. So those are the groups I've started. And part of what all of those groups are doing, independent of me, independent of my campaign, but they are embedded in community, making sure people understand what the voting laws are, what changed, what stayed the same, and why it matters. Separately, our campaign is doing that same work through our voter protection efforts. That's why we're urging people to vote early.
Yeah.
We get 3 weeks of voting in Georgia starting October 17th. Because of how difficult these new laws are, because of the hurdles that Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger have put in place, do not get distracted by the fact that they didn't commit treason. The same time they were not committing treason, they were also putting in more voter suppression laws. And because of those new voter suppression laws, we need folks to vote early to get it out of the way. In Georgia, we have the #1 likelihood of having long lines in Black communities, up to 8 hours. And so if we want people to be able to vote, we need to get our votes banked. We need to get it done and get on with our lives. And that means voting as much as possible, as early as possible. And when I say as much as possible, I mean getting as many people as possible. Nobody should vote more than once.
No,
I don't want anyone to take me out of context.
Yeah.
So
What words of encouragement do you have for the citizens of Georgia who may feel as if no matter what they do, if they vote early or they bring friends with them, it won't have an impact on the outcome?
I have proven that it matters. In 2018, I didn't become governor by 54,723 votes.
That's two concerts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's 2 concerts. And there were enough people. Now, there were a lot of people who tried to vote who weren't allowed to participate in our elections, but there were a lot more people who didn't think their voices mattered. And it's a truism, but if your voice didn't matter, they wouldn't be working so hard to stop you from being heard.
That's true.
But the other part of it is, and it's a legitimate critique, for a lot of folks, they've never seen their lives change. It didn't really matter who got elected because their lives stayed the same. You've never had anyone like me running for office. What I like to describe is not what I did before I ran, but when I didn't win, I still made sure that I helped pay off the medical debt of 68,000 Georgians, especially people who wanted to start their own businesses, because we know that medical debt often stops you from being able to do anything. I made sure that people got access to the COVID vaccine. I started at a company that was moving millions of dollars to small businesses. I made sure that if you were on EBT when you weren't getting the stimulus checks, that we got $1,000 check written to a bunch of families across Georgia who weren't getting the money they needed. That's what I do when I don't have the job. Imagine what I would do if I had the job. So I'm not asking people to forget what they know. I'm asking them to believe what they see. Yes, the current governor reopened the state, but he also passed a law making it illegal for anyone who got harmed, any essential worker, to sue their boss for not having protection. We have one of the highest rates of death from COVID in the nation. And so, yes, some people benefited, but most of our businesses didn't get a dime of PPP. He got money. He gave a $694 million contract to his friends for giving him money in his campaign. My mission has been and always will be, how do you invest in people to make sure they thrive? Because I've been at the bottom and I don't want to be there, and I don't think anyone else needs to be there. If you're willing to work for it, my mission is to work with you, but I've got to get the job first, and that's why I need folks to show up.
This that Red Panda Anthem. Ian, what's up? This that Red Panda Anthem. Red Panda, what's good? Red Panda Anthem. Whole clip going up. I know they can't stand it.